When humans return to the moon, they will arrive in a vehicle that dwarfs anything that has come before it. The Starship Human Landing System, or HLS, stands roughly 15 stories tall on the lunar surface. 50 years ago, Apollo hardware was constrained by what a single rocket could lift. The entire lunar module was a fraction of that height, weighing just over 4 metric tons. The Starship HLS weighs in closer to 100 tons. Launching a massive 100-ton lander directly from Earth to the surface of the moon is physically impossible with current rocketry. The vehicle is simply too heavy to make the trip in one shot. To bypass the limits of single-launch rockets, NASA and SpaceX had to develop an entirely different architecture. They are abandoning the direct route in favor of a complex multi-vehicle sequence that stages the pieces in space before the mission even begins. This graphic shows Starship configurations, with HLS on the right. Never returning to Earth, engineers removed its heavy heat shield and aerodynamic flaps, freeing mass for lunar hardware. It features modified landing legs and 2 separate airlocks, one for space docking and one for the moon. Because the habitable crew quarters are located near the top of the vehicle, astronauts cannot simply climb down a ladder. They will use a multi-story elevator system to lower themselves and their cargo from the airlock down to the lunar dust. Every design choice is hyper-optimized for the lunar environment. This massive spacecraft is uniquely built to launch from Earth, operate autonomously in deep space, and never return home. The mission begins by lifting the empty HLS lander into low Earth orbit atop a massive super-heavy booster. The physical profile of this rocket is so extreme that engineers have spent countless hours in the transonic and supersonic wind tunnels at NASA Ames, validating the aerodynamics of the launch vehicle before it ever leaves the pad. The sheer effort of escaping Earth's gravity consumes nearly all of the lander's liquid oxygen and methane. Once it reaches orbit, the HLS is practically empty. To solve this, SpaceX will launch a series of tanker starships. These tankers will ferry fresh propellant up to a dedicated depot spacecraft, which waits in Earth orbit to store the resources. The empty HLS lander will then dock with the depot. In the zero-gravity vacuum of space, tons of cryogenic fuel must flow between the two vehicles to fully load the lander. Managing sub-zero cryogenic liquids in microgravity without them boiling off or leaking is intensely difficult. Mastering this in-orbit transfer is the critical technical bottleneck standing between humanity and a return to the moon. Fully fueled, the HLS departs Earth. It travels to the moon and inserts itself into a near-rectilinear halo orbit, a highly elliptical path that provides constant line of sight to Earth. Only after the lander is safely waiting in lunar orbit does the human crew begin their journey. They launch separately from Florida aboard NASA's Space Launch System rocket. The astronauts travel inside the Orion capsule, navigating the multi-day transit from Earth to intercept the waiting HLS. The two spacecraft rendezvous in lunar orbit. Orion uses a flight-proven soft capture system, adapted from SpaceX's Dragon vehicle, to latch on to the nose of the towering lander. The crew then moves through the airlock, crossing the threshold between a NASA spacecraft and a SpaceX lander. The surface mission can only begin if this deep space mechanical handshake works perfectly. 2 astronauts transfer into the HLS, detach from Orion, and begin their powered descent. They are aiming for the lunar South Pole, a region known for rugged terrain and harsh lighting. Bringing a vehicle of this mass down to the surface poses a unique physical threat. Firing the massive Raptor engines all the way to touchdown would blast lunar regolith outward at high velocities, potentially damaging the lander or surrounding equipment. To prevent this, the HLS relies on a ring of mid-body gaseous thrusters for the final meters of descent. By moving the exhaust higher up the hole, the thrust safely disperses, protecting the landing zone. After touchdown, the crew faces the challenge of getting outside. They must navigate from the high-altitude airlock, carrying their equipment, and ride the mechanical elevator down to the surface in low gravity. The spatial constraints of this elevator system are actively being validated by NASA astronauts like Nicole Mann. They run suited tests on full-scale mock-ups to refine the controls, gate latches, and cargo spacing. Once they step off the elevator, the crew has access to a multi-story base camp. The HLS carries enough mass and life support to sustain surface expeditions for nearly a week. At the end of the surface mission, the entire lander lifts off. It ascends back into the lunar halo orbit to mate the waiting Orion capsule. The astronauts transfer their lunar samples and themselves back into Orion. Having fulfilled its purpose, the massive Starship HLS remains behind in lunar orbit. The Orion capsule breaks away and fires its engines, accelerating toward the distant Earth for the journey home. This architecture abandons the historical idea of a single spacecraft carrying a crew from launch pad to landing and back. It relies entirely on specialized vehicles passing the baton, each performing a single role. This entire sequence still requires rigorous validation. SpaceX must execute an uncrewed demonstration of this exact choreography, including the orbital refueling and lunar landing, before any astronauts step aboard. Committing to a colossal lander and relying on orbital refueling are highly deliberate choices. They add massive logistical complexity in the short term, but they solve long-term deep space challenges. Sending humans deeper into the solar system requires the ability to transfer cryogenic propellants in zero gravity and the capacity to lower dozens of tons of cargo onto the surface of another world. Artemis builds those specific capabilities. Mastering this sequence around the moon provides the exact logistical framework required to reach the next frontier. The Starship HLS is an active testing ground for the machinery that will eventually take humanity to Mars.